Black Lives Matter. Those three words, seemingly self-evident in any society which claims to believe in equality and human rights, have underpinned the emergence of a global movement which has propelled the relationship of race to power, the state, and capitalism, the forefront of the political conversation. But what is Black radicalism, and what can people in the 21st century, foremost among them those demanding racial justice, learn from the movements, individuals, and ideas which preceded them in the 20th century? Tonight, I'm joined by Kehinde Andrews, Professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University and author of Back to Black, Retelling Black Radicalism for the 21st Century. Kehinde, welcome to Novara Media.
Good evening. Thanks for having me on.
It's great to have you on. I'm going to get right into the meat of this and go into a cliche of Black radicalism, or how it was kind of articulated in the Anglophone world in the 20th century. When people hear the words Black radical, they think of Martin Luther King, they think of Malcolm X. Can you talk about the relationship between these two men? And actually, they didn't really know one another particularly well, and often there was, if not a personal antipathy between them, a major political gulf.
Yeah, so it's interesting, you know, Malcolm and Martin are around at the same time. They're similar ages. They're doing what we think of typically as being similar work, but only ever meet once. And it's really briefly, and it's just before Malcolm X is assassinated. And they're remembered largely through the trope of Malcolm was violent, Martin Luther King was non-violence. In fact, neither of them ever did any political violence. The antipathy between them wasn't about violence, and it wasn't personal. It really was about two very different ways of understanding society. Malcolm basically said, look, this system, America, can no more provide freedom, justice, and equality than a chicken can lay a duck egg. It's just not meant to do it. There is no reform. Whereas Martin Luther King represented the civil rights movement, which was a reformist movement, looked to get people access and to change the laws. And that was the big difference between the both of them. So Martin Luther King, in that sense, isn't a radical. Radicalism is about overturning, overthrowing, completely transforming the system.
So we're going to get a graphic up from a guy called Maajid Nawaz. Have you heard of Maajid Nawaz?
I have, yes.
Yeah, for an American audience, maybe they haven't, but in the UK, he's relatively well-known guy as a show on LBC. We'll get this up. And this kind of really articulates the paradigm of how Malcolm X, he's had the temerity to misspell Malcolm. I think that's how you spell the Brazilian footballer Malcolm for Barcelona. But anyway, strong, non-violent, all caps, POC. You would dispute that tag, more of that later. Icons are our leaders and teachers. They're well known. They are known to us well. They're well known to us. Mahatma. Can we just keep that? Sorry, Gary. Mahatma, as in Mahatma Gandhi. Madiba, as in Nelson Mandela. Martin Luther King, and Malcolm. We don't need your communist Stalin, Mao, Castro, and Che to appropriate our voice and struggle. What do you make of that tweet in terms of the kind of the equivalence between, because again, it's kind of very white liberal, Maajid Nawaz is brown, but white liberal idea of peaceful 20th century story of non-violent progress driven by people of color.
It reminds me of something. I won't say who it was, but somebody sent me a message when Maajid Nawaz was doing something with Malcolm X's birthday, I think it was. No, Malcolm X's assassination. And they said, oh, it's that Uncle Tom Maajid. That's exactly the words they use, not my words. And it's just that kind of the worst way of remembering these figures. I mean, they're all different. Mahatma Gandhi is very different to Malcolm. He's different to Martin, and even Gandhi is different to Martin Luther King, although there were similarities. And one of the worst things that we do with Black history more generally is we just kind of lump it all in together as one indistinguishable mesh. I mean, no, look, one of the biggest critiques of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, perhaps the biggest critique I've ever come across, was Malcolm X. So to just lump him in is insane. Malcolm probably had more to do with Castro than King in many ways.
Yeah. We're going to go to a video now. This is from the 2016 Super Bowl. Probably some of you remember it. I had Beyonce Knowles, and it was seen as kind of, the apogee of a post-race America. So let's go to that video.
You just might be a Black Bill Gates in the making.
Black Bill Gates, I forgot all about that.
So did I, actually.
So obviously the iconography there is quite obvious. You've got kind of Black Panther style stuff going on with the hair, with the berets, and so on. What was your take on that? For a lot of people, that was a really positive development. You've got a strong Black woman at the forefront of American popular culture, but you didn't necessarily see it as a step forward. Why is that?
Well, I actually got in a bit of trouble for this, and because I think the reaction that I had was misinterpreted. So, like when I watched this, and I watched it live, I'm a big American football fan, so I was watching it while doing some work, and never really had any strong feelings about it. This is what we've kind of come to respect from Beyonce, typical Beyonce performance. What got me annoyed was, 3-4 days afterwards, hearing this was this radical take on America. Isn't it wonderfully new? Look, that wasn't an homage to the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party, which was an organization 50% female, had really important, strong female leaders like Kathleen Cleaver. Just a really important organization. They had a uniform, they had a way of doing things. Performing at the Super Bowl at the high point of commercialism is not the Black Panther Party. It really isn't. What Beyonce was doing was a homage to blaxploitation, which is a very particular take on the Black Panther movement, which puts Black women in particular roles, right? Sexualized, etc., etc. And this is not, look, as anybody has no right to tell Beyonce what she should or shouldn't do with her body. That's up to her. The question is, how do we interpret that? And do we interpret this as this radical new image? And there was nothing radical or new there. It was selling Blackness as we've seen Blackness sold many times in American popular culture.
But do you think, obviously, in the context of Donald Trump winning the presidential election later that year, the kind of ascent of white supremacist thinking, and I don't use those words lightly. We saw, for instance, straight after the presidential election, people doing "Hail Trump" and so on. In that context, do you not see some value, even if there's a recuperation of Black dissent within the American mainstream? Do you see no political value or use in that whatsoever?
No, I think it's interesting because I think actually as a statement and as a way that people rallied around and singing about it, Negro knows, that's important because it's so whitewashed, and actually to see that in the Super Bowl in some ways is different. And if it inspires people, that's all well and good. But we do have to look at what the limits of that are, right? And I think that's really important. That's a performance which is sanctioned by the NFL. The NFL is one of the most reactionary bodies in the American polity, really. And also, I think one of the problems we have is that we do tend to be a little bit reactive when we see the bad guys, right? You see Trump as what Malcolm would call the Southern wolf, the open racist, and kind of we react to that. But we're not as quick to react to the Northern fox, who's trickier, who's still being just as racist, but is pretending they're smiling. And that's the NFL having that performance. Sucking you in, making you think it's great, but still Kaepernick ain't got a job. At the basic level, Colin Kaepernick can't get an NFL job. So I think that's my problem with it. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it's certainly not radical, and the limitations of it go back to really. And I guess this is the big thing. It's not new. We have seen this before, and I think sometimes our historical memory is a bit lapsed, I think.
Well, from one cultural icon, Beyonce knows, to another, Nancy Pelosi. I don't know if our viewers saw this image of her taking the knee. If we can get this image up, graphic 3, Gary, wearing a kente cloth. And this is something which often African-American students wear at graduation ceremonies, as I understand it, to sort of celebrate to celebrate their heritage.
Yeah.
In terms of that image, what does that say to you? Is that a bunch of primarily Americans of European heritage kind of recuperating a symbol of Black individuality? Or is it something else? The counter argument would be that, the essence of what it is to be American is perhaps up for grabs. Which one would you say it is?
Well, that's a strong claim. I think we'll go back to Malcolm and his Northern Fox. The Democratic Party is terrible. Let's be honest. The history of the Democratic Party isn't much better than the history of the Republican Party in terms of if you look at the structural racism of America. And this is so easy when you look at that and you can say, well, look, isn't this great? They're doing this nice symbolic gesture. But actually, what are they doing in their party? Joe Biden is the Democratic nominee, which I think tells you a lot about where we are with the Democratic Party. So I think to me, it sticks in the throat. In many ways, this is just an easy picture, tokenistic, symbolic, doesn't mean any kind of change at all. And it's the kind of thing, when I saw it, I rolled my eyes and felt a little bit sick. And I think a lot of Black people would have felt the same.
Do you not think though that that binary of the northern fox, the southern wolf? But if a Democratic politician feels compelled to do that, it is effectively saying to southern wolf voters, people in, I don't know, where Bill Clinton came from, Little Rock, Arkansas, and parts of the Deep South, that actually we don't really necessarily want you to vote. Now, in a sense, there's an electoral calculus behind that, because 80% plus of African Americans vote Democrat, but there is also a political overhead for them doing that, right? So, I mean, yes, it's opportunism, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a completely pointless political statement. Or are you saying, no, this is...
I mean, I don't know. Look, you could make that case, but I think America's so polarized now. I think the Democrats have given up on many of the places where that would be a bad thing. I think there is a huge electoral calculus in this, in terms of, and they know, look, this Black Lives Matter has come back on the scene. Black vote is absolutely essential. If you look at what happened in the last election, Black voters not turning out in the same numbers. That's one of the things that submarined Hillary. So I think this is a cynical ploy to get Black voters. I haven't seen anything from the Democratic Party that suggests they're talking about abolition of the police or defunding the police, or the structural things about making sure that work pays for African Americans. Those are the things. And when you have a party with such a terrible history, I mean, mass incarceration, for example, I mean, it's Bill Clinton's crime bill is one of the key moments that really cements mass incarceration. And there's no apology, atonement for any of that. So kneeling with kente cloth is not just nothing, it's worse than nothing, because it's a kind of token gesture that makes them feel better, but doesn't do anything for us.
Hold that thought. You might have the same conclusion for the next image. This is the next graphic. This is Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner, the leader of the Labour Party and the deputy leader of the Labour Party, both taking... I like Angela Rayner's shoes, can I say, her boots, and it's quite interesting. It's good, nice footwear. Would you have the same conclusion in regards to that, them taking the knee? Is that the same sort of thing? Would it be better if they just didn't do it at all?
Yeah, I think some things you just need to understand. That's what I say with allyship. Just understand what your place is. Taking the knee in the kind of that stage setting, that's just not allyship. That's not what we need. What we need from the Labour Party, if Labour Party is serious, is to come up with a platform for racial justice, which is far from. I mean, I don't remember. I don't know. Maybe I haven't been listening, but I haven't heard Keir Starmer say anything particularly useful over the last couple of weeks, unfortunately.
His response to Edward Colston on BBC, the statue, and he said, well, it's criminal that they shouldn't have done that. Obviously, he's former director of public prosecutions. He's not going to go around saying, yeah, criminal damage is great, but were you surprised by that? I mean, do you think could it have been done in a more intelligent way?
Yeah, I think it shows they're playing both sides of the fence, right? I think you look at the Democrats doing it is electoral calculus, because they need to get African American voters. That's priority, like number one, is get lots of African American voters to the polls. We just saw with the Brexit election that the Black vote doesn't count for that much here. What kept Labour out of power was the old Labour heartlands, where there's very, very few of us. So their electoral calculus here is very much, how do we play to the imagined white working class, right? And that's why you see this. We kind of want to just keep, because we know Black people do vote for us, and we want to keep them aside a little bit, but we're going to go with this criminal damage. No, it's nonsense. It's not criminal damage. Pulling down a statue is not criminal damage. That's a protest. That's not a crime. It's not an offense if it's seen in its proper context. And I would have expected, and I'm sure if Jeremy Corbyn was still leader, we'd have got a very different response.
Yeah. Going back to the States, Barack Obama. This I'm bombarding you. You're a doctor. You've written this great book. You would think it's going to be at the realm of the sort of ether of ideas, which we'll do. Final question about current affairs. Barack Obama, first African American president, 2008 to 2016. Was he good or bad for African Americans?
I think no American president can be good for African Americans. I mean, that's how we have to understand it. The American presidency it's called the White House for a reason. The point is to maintain and to perpetuate white supremacy. So if you look at 8 years of Barack Obama, every single indicator for African Americans went down, apart from one, which was employment. So they're a bit more employed in relation to white people. But then when you actually look at the kinds of employment, that's a completely empty statistic. So half, and this is a crazy book from a stat from Keeanga Taylor's book, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. Half of all Black people who have jobs in New York City are employed in fast food restaurants.
Wow.
I mean, it's insane. I mean, like, that's an insane statistic. So people have work, but it doesn't pay. So at the same time that African Americans caught up a little bit in terms of employment rates, and that's all gone now, by the way, the actually food stamp usage went up by something like 11 times in African American communities because of the kind of work that people were doing. So what did Barack Obama, 8 years, Black Lives Matter starts under Barack Obama's presidency, and it's just as important now because he didn't really do anything to fix it. So no, how could any presidency be good for Black people in America? That's the point, I think.
But I mean, you probably saw this as well on Twitter. People sharing images of, I think, David Walliams as a white Brit. I mean, he's not particularly well placed to decide who's good for African Americans, but he shared a picture of Barack Obama saying, "Oh, wouldn't it be great if this guy was in charge again?" You sort of disagree with that. And in the aftermath of George Floyd, do you think things would have been any different or any more productive?
We're forgetting that he was in charge. Like, we had these exact same things happen in 2016. That he was the president. Or Black Lives Matter when Trayvon Martin was killed, and the only contribution he made was to come on TV and say, "My son would have looked like Trayvon." Well, that's nice, but you're like, what are you actually going to do about it? I mean, I think one thing that is different, and I think and again, I caution about this as well. I did get, my mom wasn't happy when I said this, but I will say it again. Actually, in some ways, a Trump presidency is better for African Americans than an Obama presidency, because with Obama, you've got the wolf and the fox, and people don't really get that upset with the fox. You know, he lets you into the White House, he sings Al Green songs, and he does the right, he says the right things, right? So you kind of give him a bit of slack. Whereas under Trump, because he's the wolf, everybody gets angry, and part of the things that certainly part of what's fueling the level of protests in the States and here, I think, is just Trump's terrible. Trump's response is as bad as it could possibly be, and so people are more vocal, more out in the streets, more understanding that actually we're not getting anything from this system. So in that sense, actually, Trump is better, because Trump is a better reflection of what America is, and maybe that means that we're more likely to fight it.
Such a good point. I mean, you know, obviously George Floyd was murdered. You get these mass protests. I mean, they go beyond protests. They also include, you'd call rioting. I don't say it in a negative sense. You know, the Sidney Tarrow, social movement scholar, would call it contentious collective action. You know, sometimes a protest can border into a riot, or a strike can border into a riot, or a you know,
rebellion.
whatever.
We say rebellion.
Rebellion, exactly. Because a protest kind of sounds quite choreographed in the 21st century, and it wasn't that. And what you got very quickly was these police officers being arrested, being charged. And I couldn't help but think, if this was Barack Obama, there would have been a mass demonstration with Obama at the front with some, you know, various religious leaders and congressmen, and you know what, there wouldn't have been the mass protest, the rebellion, as you put it, and these officers probably wouldn't even have been charged. You know, and it's kind of like you say, maybe at least Trump is a reflection of the reality of American power.
Yeah, I mean, and we saw that. So Obama, when these things happened, Obama kind of rallied the symbolic, and actually probably it did temper. I don't want to say it tempered necessarily, because there were big protests and even rebellions in 2016, even, and certainly Ferguson. I mean, Ferguson was probably, may have been a bigger scale than this. That's how short our memories are sometimes. This just happened, right? But definitely, I think the fact that you have, and not just right now, like Trump's presidency has been bad for many reasons leading up to this, and certainly on race issues, immigration issues. It's been a tipping point where people have rebelled and been on the streets. And I think, yeah, you probably actually have had more change in that way. Ironically, like, the police actually were charged relatively quickly, something we have really never seen before. And I think that is because of the strength of the rebellion. But again, I'm not necessarily saying this is a good thing. I think we should be rebelling like this, whether it's Obama or Trump. But if it takes a Trump figure to do it, then so be it, I guess.
So lots of Brits will be looking at the events in the United States with George Floyd, and they'll be situating it within the context of uniquely American racism. And what I think you do really well in the book, actually, and it's the first time I've seen the argument. I'm sure you've drawn it's a brilliant synthesis of so many literatures. But this idea of, you know, analogous to the kind of plantocracy of the American South is the West Indies. And obviously, economically, that's true. But what you say in the sort of here and now is that, you know, Black Britons should look at sort of West Indians as their compatriots, people today in Trinidad and Jamaica and so on, as kind of almost their compatriots. Can you sort of unravel that a bit? How far do those similarities go? Should we say, you know, actually, you could basically map on Britain to the United States from the Confederacy onwards?
In some ways you can, right? So, and this is one of the things, talking to Americans a lot, I get this, well, slavery wasn't that important to Britain, and definitely in Britain you hear that a lot. But it's really wrong. The only real difference between America and Britain is that slavery takes place within the nation state of what we think of as being America. So when slavery ends, you have millions of African Americans in the nation, and they have to deal with them, which is, a century and a half of real not an activism, but just conversations, discussions about race. How do we deal with race? Whereas here, because we offshored slavery into the Caribbean, we think of that as actually being a different place. So if you actually look at a lot of the coverage, they even talk about it as West Indian slavery. Britain's role was to abolish slavery. It wasn't to actually do slavery. And you have that separation is important because it really distances how we think of black people in Britain. But if we were to say, well, let's understand that the Caribbean was part of the nation state. Britain was an empire. It wasn't these three little islands. It was the little island with these four home countries. It was part of the nation state in the same way the South, American South, was part of the US nation state. And slavery was just as important, just as vital. And then you have emancipation. And the only real difference is because of the distance, it takes a lot longer for migration to happen in America, you had the Great Migration from the former slaveholding South into the North much earlier. Whereas here you have migration from the slaveholding Caribbean to Britain. It takes longer for lots of reasons, right? But when it happens really in exactly the same way, right? What do African Americans find when they go north? They're expecting liberation because it's the North that freed the South, in the same way that Caribbeans were expecting some kind of freedom because it was Britain that freed the slaves, right? They're expecting good education, expecting housing, etc. But on both migrant trails, they find exactly the same thing: segregation, institutional racism, problems with the police, problems with the schools. I mean, it really is exactly the same. There's a reason why when I read Malcolm X as a 14-year-old, I was like, wow, this just makes sense. Because because we have this kind of narrow nation state way of looking at things, we don't see that it's really the very, very, very similar process.
And I guess Jamaica and the West Indies they're settler colonies, right? So that basically what happens is after 1492, the indigenous peoples get wiped out, as happens across the Americas. Now, there's a slightly different relationship to Africa that doesn't happen there with regards to even white settler colonies like Kenya, Namibia, Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, etc. I mean, they give it a pretty good shot, but it's not the same. Fortunately, it's not the same for a bunch of reasons. Again, sort of, and this isn't touched upon in the book, but I've been thinking about it a lot. If you look at, for instance, racial segregation in Kenya between whites and blacks, it's exactly the same as Jim Crow. It's exactly the same as Jim Crow. And I just feel like the most fertile farmland of Kenya was called the White Highlands. And I was like, why was it called the White Highlands? I thought maybe there was like something that was, it was like the White Cliffs of Dover. They were, physically colored white. But no, it's just only white people are allowed to own land there. Why do you think it's so neglected in Britain that we don't really think of ourselves as so analogous to the United States? We think we're so different when in fact we're so similar. But why do you think we're ignorant of that?
Yeah, it's because it was thousands of miles away, right? Slavery happened thousands of miles away. Kenya is thousands of miles away. So we can pretend that actually, the nation, what happens in the nation state is totally separate from what happens in the colonies. But actually, if you actually look at racial relations in, like you said, the South, so segregation is basically the same as apartheid. It's basically the same as what happens in Kenya. It's basically the same what happens on the plantocracies in the Caribbean. And I mean, Britain is the architect of America. I mean, the Britain that founds the colonies in the first place. So you can't really separate. The idea you could separate Britain from America is madness. It's, as Malcolm X says, racism is not an American problem, it's a world problem. And the biggest problem that we have in Britain is that nation state, that not understanding the empire was part of the nation state. So one of the things that really annoys me when we think about Black history is the idea that I have to prove there were Black people on this island centuries ago to somehow have a stake in the nation. No, my family in the Caribbean were in Britain. Like, we were building Britain centuries ago. And once we start to understand that, then we can see the analogies of it's the same system, and it articulates itself somewhat differently in different places, but it's the same basic system for all of us.
I think I'm going to know the answer to this question, but has Britain been a force for good in the world?
Oh no! How could it possibly have been a force for good? For good? I mean, if you think railways are good, then I guess maybe Britain's built railways in places. No, if you look overarchingly, and I think this again, if you think about the British Empire, it's an empire built on racism, genocide, the levels of violence that we would not really accept if it was anybody else. History is taught by the winner, and the fact is, Britain's on top, the West is on top, America's on top. But actually, you actually had to. There is no political economic systems ever existed in history than the West, and you can't really separate Britain from France and Spain and America. It's kind of one big. It's kind of one. They're all in cahoots, all related, all part of the same empire. It's claimed more lives by a factor of probably 30 than anything else ever. And that's the reality of. So you can progress, look at science, look at medicine, but actually the dark side of that is hundreds, probably billions of black and brown lives spilled in order to build this empire.
How many? I mean, do we know the best sort of guesstimates or?
So actually, the book I just finished writing was it's called, what's it called? It's called The New Age of Empire: How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World, basically. And I couldn't tell you a number, but this is the first. Take the founding genocide of the Americas.
Yeah.
Where even actually Back to Black, it's one of the things did I change? I think I did change it in the second edition. Was I kind of had this bit about the Caribbean sparsely populated and Europeans came in. That I had to do some research. That's not true. The Caribbean was civilized, deeply complex communities. Estimates of at least 70 million people killed in the genocide since 1492, and within 200 years, at least 70 million people killed just in that genocide. That doesn't include slavery. That doesn't include colonialism. That doesn't include famines. I mean, the number's staggering. Maybe one day somebody will add it up, but it will be a very large number of lives. And even now as well, because I think it's what we tend to forget. 9 million people die every year in the world because they're hungry, and they're hungry because of Western capitalism. That's why they're hungry. That's why they are poor. That's why they can't eat. So it's not like that violence has gone away. It's still very much with us in the present.
Well, it's about the whole thing about man-made climate change, the Anthropocene, that it started like with the Industrial Revolution. And there's pretty good evidence to suggest that actually, depopulation of the Americas was a global climate event because you had the reforestation of Central and South America that obviously sucks in more CO2, create more oxygen, and global temperatures went up a degree. Yeah,
they actually reckon the genocide was so great it actually raised the temperature, which is insane when you think about it. And then another thing I just put to hasn't the West brought good to the world? If we carry on the way we're going, the whole world's going to end. Like, I mean, what empire in history actually ended the world? I mean, I think that's the stakes that we're talking about. And this is actually one of the things. So when I was writing the newer book, the publishers are trying to make me a bit more positive about. I'm very positive about Black Revolution. I'm less positive about the West saving itself and imagining a new future. But if we're honest, the West doesn't have a choice. You cannot go on the way that it's going on, or they'll literally the world will end. So maybe that's where the hope lies.
You've talked about different European. We should sort of see it all as a kind of integrated whole, various European nations. But I think 9% of Germans think that the German Empire was a good thing, which is obviously 9% too many, but it's really low.
It's low.
Whereas 30% of Brits think the British Empire was a good thing. So what do you think is so unique about Britain that people still think, very few people, Spaniards generally don't, they might think it, but very few openly say, the Spanish Empire is really good. What makes Britain so unique in people quite overtly saying that, do you think?
Well, I think, so the Nazis is a big one, right? The Nazis is a huge part of that story. One of the reasons why Germans don't think that is relates to the Nazis. And again, this is, how do we understand racism badly? You need the bad guys. You need look, those are the racists. And so Germany's been really ashamed of that, rightly so as well. And so has kind of wanted to create a different narrative for their history. If you look at Britain's take on the Nazis, this is essentially the problem, right? It's the British Empire that beats the Nazis. It's the Brits, the great Brits, that beat the Nazis and build this great, wonderful world, which is not true. Russia was probably more important. America's certainly important. Europe's important. Africa, the Caribbean. It is a world. They call it the World War for a reason. But more importantly, it shows how deeply we misunderstand the Nazis. It's a great book by Zygmunt Bauman, Holocaust and Modernity, where he basically argues that the Holocaust is not an aberration. It's the logic of the West just brought home into Europe. And if you actually look at, and we often see the Holocaust as being this separate event, this massively terrible thing which has no historical correlate. That's again ridiculous. It fits into Belgium, where Leopold kills 10 million people. The genocide we talked about that started the West. I mean, these kind of genocides and loss of life based on race, that is the history and story of the West, and particularly the British Empire. But because we've kind of romanticized, it is Britain, it is the empire that beats the Nazis and builds this great world, we just can't come to terms with that at all.
You've written a piece in The Guardian, and you touched on this again. Originally, I was going to ask you, why do you not like the term people of color? But that's more of an American term. But in this article for The Guardian, you say you don't like the term BAME. Why is that?
I'm not sure anybody likes the term BAME. In some ways, BAME is like a halfway house of how do we say non-white without saying non-white. And this is why I don't like the term people of color or BAME. If we wouldn't say non-white, why on earth would we say BAME or POC or whatever? If you look at the history of what we call political blackness in the UK, look, there's a history of it certainly, and unity across ethnic minority groups is absolutely essential. I mean, look, in my profession, there's so few black people that you couldn't possibly have. You would have to have unity with other minorities because there's so few of us, right? And so what we have is a history, and what we have in the UK and globally is a really strong history of minority or global majority groups working together on issues. The problem with BAME or POC, and particularly my problem actually is more with the idea of political blackness, is that it erases the concept of blackness in itself. So blackness in African ancestry, which is what black radicalism is about, what black studies is about. It erases that as a legitimate form of unity and saying we should have this cross non-white unity, which is for me deeply problematic because it centers whiteness in the definition of what we're doing. And I don't know why you'd want to center whiteness in how we understand ourselves.
So just for people watching, what is, I mean, the average American goes political blackness? What the hell is that? Can you explain that a little bit? Because it's a bit of a, well, it's not, I don't know if it's uniquely British, but that's the tradition it comes out of.
Yeah, so political blackness is the idea that if you're a visible minority, if you're not white, then you're black. So, and there have been in the UK, so even the British Black Panthers party was a politically black organization, had people from the Indian subcontinent, from China, from anybody who wasn't white. And there's been a history of organizing, there still is a history of organizing in the UK, particularly in professional places like the Teachers Union, the Black Lecturers Union, because there's so few of us. But it's never really been something that really fit. It's always been something that people have resisted. And there is this not true version of history where in the 60s and 70s everybody worked together and then all of a sudden it all splintered. That's just not true. There has always been black in terms of African descent or Indian organization or Pakistani organization. That's actually been the dominant form of organizing in the UK, and people have come together based on issues. I think that's where you find real solidarity, coming together on the issues that we face.
Yeah, I always found the political blackness thing really odd because I grew up around Middle Easterners and lots of them were racist. You know, not lots of them's unfair, but you know, they were just as likely to be racist as a white person.
I think that's part of I think anti-blackness is a key part of the way that the global economy works. And actually, in the book I've just finished, there's a whole bit on that where actually the West, white supremacy is hugely a part of the West. But in white supremacy, you have white at the top, black at the bottom, and there is a hierarchy in between, and there is a long history of groups in the different part of the hierarchy using that to better themselves, and that's no different today. China, for example.
Well, there's also, I mean, apparently Brazilians were really open to Japanese immigrants in the early 20th century because they were classified as the whites of Asia, which is kind of anyway.
No, it shouldn't be a surprise. Brazil's terrible. Brazil, if you've got a country that's a lot like America, it's Brazil. Settler colony based on slavery has a white supremacy in Brazil is terrible. I mean, and one of the things I really, with the people of color thing in America, is, well, now we're actually assigning the term people of color to European migrants who went to Latin America, who established white supremacist systems, and then when they cross into America, all of a sudden they're people of color. No, they're just white people. I don't really understand. And it does tell us the worst thing we can do with understanding how racism works is to nationalize it, and that's the big problem with
But
political
here's okay. So here's I mean, I agree with that, not just in the abstract. I mean, like I've seen Middle Easterns be as bad, or if not more racist than white people. But do you not think, for instance, let's go to the British context. There has often been, especially in regards to discourses around Islamophobia, you would see white nationalists say, "Well, I'm far happier actually with a black person here because look, they play for the national team, they talk like us. You know, second, third generation West Indians, they're basically like us. They're in the sitcoms, they dress like us, and actually the other there, who you know their complexion is you know is perhaps." You know, they might be only half Iraqi or something, but they're racialized as the other far more than the person of sort of West Indian heritage. What do you think about that? Does that mean I've got bad race politics if I sort of make that observation? Or
no, certainly. Look, there's no doubt about it that certain groups are racialized, and there's a huge problem, and Islamophobia is a massive problem, and we're seeing that more so in the current climate as well. But again, it's different. It's if we cannot locate racism on those individual prejudices of the so-called racist people, right? So yes, like Caribbean people have been more accepted on a kind of superficial cultural level. I guess we've assimilated more into the state, but actually look at all the statistics tell you that don't really get you anywhere, right? Racism is deeply structural, and so that's how we should be analyzing it, not necessarily in, you know, am I more comfortable with a Muslim person or a black person? And you can be both a Muslim person and a black person as well. So it's definitely, and again, what I would also say is that cross unity is hugely important. Black radicalism is 100% against Islamophobia and will always rally to that cause. And I think if you actually look historically, whether it be the Black Panther Party, whether it be the Pan-African movement, both here and around the world, I mean, those are movements who have always had solidarity with other oppressed people. And I only found out about Israel-Palestine through Black radicalism. That's how I got into it. And that's always, those solidarities always very, very, very much been in there.
This is a brilliant jumping off point. If we can just get up graphic 5, Gary, against integration. For black radicals, yeah, it's graphic 5. Sorry, Gaza. I jumped one, yeah. For black radicals, America, Britain, or any other Western nation state, not places which we should be seeking to integrate into, but rather empires that we need to oppose, not beloved communities of shared tradition and aspirations, but coercive states to be overthrown. For black radicals. So again, so going back to that point, we're looking at, look at the United States. It's going to become a minority majority country. Probably, I mean, we never know about these things, you know, but probably by the 2050s, 2060s. When you say for black radicals, I mean, what do you mean? I mean, because in Britain, we'll probably hit minority majority in 2070s. You're in Birmingham, it's going to be a minority, it basically already is a minority majority city. It's not just, you know, in places like, I wonder in that kind of, because there is this thought through black tradition going back, you know, more than well over a century. I just wonder, where does it sit in the kind of conversation around people of mixed heritage, non-European migrants, etc.? Could you perhaps go into the value of that?
Yeah, so that America's stat is heavily loaded with a lot of white people Hispanics who talk about themselves as white people, who act like white people, who are basically white people. So actually, I would really question that stat in America, and also here. I don't know we ever get to majority minority in the UK. Certainly in places like Birmingham, and Britain's not that diverse. This has diverse places, but if you actually, and that's part of the problem with the BAME. Even if you have a majority city like Birmingham's almost, let's say it is majority minority, well, what does that mean? There's so much differences with the minority groups, and there's so many issues. And if you look at the issues of unemployment, if you look at issues of policing, if you look at the issues of education in the city, they're still the same as they were when it was, you know, when it was not majority minority. So just because you have lots of minorities doesn't mean it changes the nature of what the place is. Atlanta would be a perfect example. Atlanta in the States is often this kind of black mecca. There's lots of black people in Atlanta. Has the worst income inequality in the entirety of the United States. So it doesn't matter if you have lots of black people. And the best place would be Africa. I mean, look at South Africa, look at the African continent. It's all black people, but it's still terrible, right? It's the system that's the problem, which is why we shouldn't be integrated into it. We need to overturn it. Because it doesn't matter how many of us are there in it, it's still going to come out with the same outcome.
Do you think that the BAME label is actually holds back black people? Because often you hear about, oh, we need more BAME representation in this organization. You know, we have it in Navarra media. There are people of West Indian and African heritage who've worked at Navarra media, but people are, oh, Navarra have got great race politics because, you know, there's Ash and there's Aaron, they've got BAME people. Obviously, Navarra, it's not such a big thing. But if you look at, for instance, the House of Commons in Parliament, you've got David Lammy, you've got a few people, but actually, how many working class black men? And I'm not, David Lammy is well educated and speaks. I know he comes from a working class background, but often when we say BAME, it does mean East Asian or South Asian people or women,
or Preeti Patel. Right.
which is great. They need to be represented, but it does feel like that then means you neglect particularly people of so African and West Indian heritage.
It's what you end up is I think someone in the States called it any black will do. So like, as long as you've got some representation, it doesn't really matter, and that's problematic for lots of reasons. One, you know, different minority groups, different experiences. Two, there is a big class issue which does get overlooked as well. Three, the representation of black women as well, right? So just saying, let's just throw some color. I mean, and just take out BAME and use the word colored or use the word non-white, and we'd understand how bad this was as an idea. And then the bigger problem is, you know, representative politics, it doesn't work, right? You get your Preeti Patels. Yes, you may well add to the color of the cabinet, but it's worse than all of them. It's the worst one. So where have you gone? What has it got you? It's just a bad way to think about progress.
We are going to be going live for about another 20 minutes. We've got about 1,400 people watching, 300 likes. If you knew nothing else tonight, smash the like button. We really appreciate it. We're talking to Kehinde Andrews, author of Back to Black. And if you are, you know, ignorant of various political traditions around black radicalism, it's a really great place to start. And what's interesting is, you know, I keep on looking at books, Kehinde, and yours is one. They're all selling really well. I was looking at the new Jim Crow, you know, sold out. And, you know, you think something strange is happening. And actually, at the weekend, we recently bought a dog, and we were talking. This sounds like a strange sort of detail, but it's relevant. We were talking to this lovely couple. They had a young family. The guy works in a car showroom. And I was talking, how's lockdown been? He goes, yeah, really weird. I'm getting so much reading done. And I'm like, oh wow, this probably is a national moment where people are reading like 2, 3, 4 times more than they normally would.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is. I've noticed that as well. You can't get a book about race or about racism, white supremacy on Amazon. They've all gone. And the States, it's the same. So if you look at the bestseller list, it's just loads of these books about racism and white supremacy, which is a good look. It has to be a good thing, right? Hopefully people are engaging. Hopefully, and that does feel a bit different. I mean, on the cynical side of me, one of the reasons I think that we are talking racism so much and it's had so much impact, it's just because there isn't much else to talk about, right? Like, it's lockdown, we're all stuck in the house, and the news is very slow. And I do wonder how much we would have paid attention to this if we'd just been going out of daily lives. But at the same time, it is an opportunity, though, to really think about the ideas, and it is encouraging that people are opening themselves up to different topics, hopefully.
Here's a question. What comes first, racism or slavery?
What comes first, racism or slavery? Racism. No, racism comes first. I mean, you can't brutalize people to that extent if you don't believe they're not human. I mean, it's not possible. Like, you just can't. There's a reason that they didn't take the white people in. There's a reason that. So even if you took it indentured labor, it's very different to slavery. The forms of it, the harshness of it, the way that it worked, it's just very, 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 very different. And there's a reason that slavery doesn't get meted out on poor whites from Europe in the same way that slavery does on Africans. You know, there is belief in inferiority. And even if you look at transatlantic slavery, the switch to taking Africans predominantly rather than enslaving the natives in Americas is for 2 reasons. One, most of them die, right? Because there's a huge genocide. But there's this whole debate in the Catholic Church. It's Bartholomew de Casas. It's like, I can't remember the years. I'm not the best person to remember years, but Bartholomew de Casas has this whole debate, and he basically wins out and says that you shouldn't enslave the natives because they can have souls and they are people, but Africans, they don't have souls. They're not really people, right? So these are really quite deep-seated ideas which explain the treatment of Africans.
What's interesting is we talked about this yesterday actually on Tysky Sour, is that, you know, people talk about Christopher Columbus being the first European to land in the Americas. He isn't. You know, it's Leif Erikson. And I wonder, like, you know, there is this kind of debate a little bit in Norse studies. This is getting very esoteric, but it's, well, why didn't the Norse do to sort of the indigenous peoples of North America what the Southern Europeans did? Do you not think there's a contingency there? Because we're about to talk about whiteness, for instance, but does whiteness necessarily mean whiteness? You know, there is a reason, for instance, why these Icelandic and Norse settlers didn't do that, but Southern Europeans did, or is it just white people?
No, whiteness and white people are separate. Like, whiteness is a particular ideology, way of viewing the world, white supremacy. It's also not a coincidence that, you know, the emergence of Columbus and, you know, the emergence of the West happens at the fall of the Muslim Empire, which was conquered into Spain. And excuse me, if you can see, and actually this is where Islamophobia and racism very, very neatly connect together, you know, in the Crusades and the idea of Western superiority. It is this idea the West is superior, and you have that, and that is basically the heart of racism. We are superior and can go and do what we would like to these people, and that does predate slavery as an institution that we understand it. Not slavery like in general or historically. I mean, there's been slavery before, and even actually, if you look at the Arab slave trade, it was actually very racialized. In some ways, Europe doesn't really invent many things, including racism, because in the 12th century, you can see very clearly people like Ibn Khaldun very clearly saying, look, Africans are not really people. But the way that gets industrialized and embedded into the political economy, that is one of the unique, probably not the only, but certainly one of the founding and unique principles of the West.
You write in your book, now this is a very provocative couple of lines. There is no reasoning with a psychosis, just as there is no point in engaging in a rational debate with whiteness. So what does that mean? Let's say you go on a GMB again with Piers Morgan. I think you've been great. But then Piers Morgan says, you think whiteness is a psychosis. What would you say to him? What do you mean you can't reason with that? Do you think these people can't be persuaded of the historical sins of their ancestors? Or what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I've been on that show enough times to know that it's white. That's one of the places the idea came from. Whiteness is a psychosis. I think the point of the psychosis thing is really, one, is not about white people, it's about whiteness. And there are plenty of black and brown people who are just as important in maintaining the psychosis. The reason I use that as a metaphor is you often, and this is one of the things I actually have quite a strong dislike, and the next book I'm writing is about the psychosis of whiteness, is in some of the ways you think about whiteness, it's almost as though it's an individual affliction to white people, that if you can just learn something different, then you can change, and that's the solution. That's a typical liberal idea about the power of knowledge, that people don't know, people are ignorant. That's not the problem. The problem is that we have a political economy which is based on the death of millions of black and brown people as much today as it ever has been. Like I said, 9 million people died from hunger. They're almost exclusively black and brown. The stealing of resources from Africa, the ridiculous wages that people are paid, or we can't even call them wages, to make the products that are imported in. I mean, that's the problem. And the reason why I say whiteness is a psychosis is because you're not going to get rid of whiteness without getting rid of the thing that causes it. And the thing that causes it is the political economy, right? You can't educate that out. The psychosis is there to make us feel better, to make us, and I include myself in this, about living in an economy which kills children daily. That's the purpose of it. So if you don't end the problem, you can't end whiteness. That's kind of the point that's being made.
So these people that are sort of going to these, I don't want to sort of go over the top of this because the facts around it are unclear, but these people sort of renouncing their racism at these mass rallies and stuff, and kissing black people's feet and so on.
Yeah.
What? I mean, for me, I think, well, racism is a social relation. This is just stupid. But how does what they're doing relate to that idea of whiteness as psychosis?
Yeah, it's the perfect example, right? Like, even like the fact you think that's a good idea, the fact you think kneeling is a good, in fact you think any of these things would possibly be something that we would appreciate, it just tells you the whole thing that even when you try to, and this is the whole point of the psychosis, is it is like talking to yourself. Even when you think you've made some change, you then see what the reaction is, and then you get these kind of just totally irrational, inexplicable things which happen. And so even though I spend a lot of time going on debating about these issues, I'm not trying to convince Piers Morgan. Like, that's not the point. The point of those kind of discussions is to highlight the issues for the secondary audience. So there's loads of black people. I go on these shows, you say, "Oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Oh yeah, that makes sense. Oh yeah, you this. I understand this bit." That's what I do, not to convince white people, because that's just not what we should be trying to do. I guess that's the point of that. To stop trying to convince white people and start organizing something else. That's what black radicalism is about.
So in that we're not going to finish with this, don't worry. But in that context, very quickly, what does allyship? I'm not a huge fan of the term allyship, but what does allyship mean, and what can people do who aren't black if they want to support black radicals?
I don't know. Like I tried really hard.
Well, you wrote about this a little bit in The Guardian, no? That's why I thought I could ask you.
Yeah, so I did write the 20 things you can do to have a more anti-racist society, because they asked me to write, and I was trying to be positive, and I do think these are good things. But I would say this, that there's a very difference between doing a good idea. So reading's a good idea, writing to your MP, not voting Tory, support organizations. So these are all good things you can do. None of them are radical. I mean, and that's the distinction. If we're talking about black radical politics, that is for, Back to Black really does try to chart how do we build black radical politics. And in terms of that, the whole point of it is that that's something that we do. And I can't give you an answer of how anybody else supports it, because that's what the politics is about.
And for black people, we're going to very briefly go on to Marcus Garvey, who is obviously, I mean, you say he's the most famous black Briton in terms of, trying to conceptualize the West Indies as part of Britain. Do you think he, and you talk about this in the book, do you think he reifies race a bit? Because that's the concern with sort of black separatism, is that you're reifying a concept which comes out of whiteness.
Yeah, so I mean, Garvey's really influential and Garvey's really important. But I think I do say in Back to Black, Garveyism is also not radical, right? Garveyism has that. I mean, it is. So one of the conceptual things I try to do in the book is blackness and race are two very different things. They're not actually the same thing. Race is a European construct. It's about biology. It's about supremacy. Blackness is, it's more like family. It's a bond. It's a historical connection. It's not about supremacy or biology in that sense. And in some way, Garvey does verify some really problematic versions of race. He's totally and utterly against race mixing, for example, like completely, in a way which is hugely problematic. But Garvey's still really important, because if you look at the Universal Negro Improvement Association, I mean, it is the biggest black organization that ever existed. It broke down the idea of the nation state, etc. And essentially what Malcolm X does is he comes later and radicalizes it and transforms how we understand it. But yeah, certainly Garvey is probably the most influential black Briton. Jamaicans don't like saying this because, Jamaican national pride is a big thing. But, Garvey was born in 1887 in Britain, and he died in 1940. He actually died in London. He actually died in the nation state. Jamaica didn't exist when he was born, when he lived. He's a British, if you want to take that tone. But yeah, he's as British as Churchill or anyone else.
This is a strange analog, but it's when people talk about, for instance, Persians, this Rumi or something, or it's very often they're from like Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, well, no, they're because I agree with you. It's like, how do we conceptualize that? Yeah. This idea of going beyond the nation state, looking for solidarities beyond the nation state. So if there's a young black person and they've been on the recent sort of Black Lives Matter demos, maybe they're new to formal political activism. They're obviously not new to the grievances, and they're wondering about what next. It seems you'd be eager to sort of emphasize the transnational element of this. So what kinds of transnational activism can people get involved in if they're trying to articulate solidarities with people in Jamaica or West Africa? What can they do?
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that going forward, what is it that we're trying to do? Because I think it's difficult in that sense. I mean, certainly, if you look at Black Lives Matter, there's massive efforts to make it global, and the protests are global, and there are lots of connections now, with the technologies that we have to kind of link people together. But in terms of real solidarity, in terms of that growth, that Universal Negro Improvement Association, this is what we basically should be trying to do. This is actually what we are. So Back to Black ends with this kind of plea of the Harambee Organization of Black Unity, which we founded, www.blackunity.org.uk, where we're saying actually, let's use this as a hub to bring people together. And there are and some of the things I've been doing recently, there's a Global African Republic Parliament now, things like this. There's lots of different things that people are trying to do. So get involved, find out, follow links, and just try and be involved with what's happening, because this really is an interesting time. We have the technology to make these connections. We don't always have the interest to do it, unfortunately.
Yeah, what was fascinating for me was that you go from George Floyd and all that, and the sort of the British articulation of it is the Edward Colston stuff, which was it was kind of odd that there wasn't only the sort of there was the geographical spread, but there's also this historical understanding of these modern grievances, these modern phenomenon. You know, that's the historic context on it.
Yeah, because I mean, the historic
context,
it's so important to understanding where we are now, right? And I think one thing's happened. America's ahead of us for all those reasons in terms of discussions about race, but they've had these discussions about monuments and all these racist monuments in the South. And it is time we have those, because actually slavery does still shape Britain today. And so these things are very, very, very much connected, interconnected, and can't be separated.
Should we remove statues of Churchill?
If you want to have anti-racist public space, then Churchill has no place in it. Let's be honest.
That's a really good. That's a really good answer. Nelson, Horatio Nelson.
The same. Like, why are we so keen for these dead white men who were involved, who were really problematic, like slavers and deeply problematic racists? Why do we have to? The thing about statues is they're not about history. Let's just get that out of it. They're not about remembering and preserving history. Removing a statue does not take somebody out of history books at all. Statues are about saying, what version of history do we want to celebrate for the present? And if we do, and I say if because I don't think we do, but if we generally do want anti-racist space, there's plenty of other statues we would put up and monuments we would put up.
If you want to ask any questions, we're going to log off in 5 minutes, if that's all right, Kehinde. We started a little bit late. If you've got any questions, please put them in the comments with a rocket emoji. While we wait for those to come in, I just want to ask you, Kehinde, what books would you recommend people if they're white, brown, black, whatever, but if they're coming at this with a completely sort of tabula rasa, they have no reading behind them, what would sort of 3 or 4 books would you recommend to them? To
understand this moment right now, there's a book, actually I'm looking at it right now, actually. It's called White Rage by Carol Anderson, African-American academic who really does explain like the history of how white resentment is played out in America and just the violence. I really like it. It's shocking, the levels of it, which really does explain, and up to today as well, like this violence hasn't really gone. Look at Ahmaud Arbery, who was lynched recently. I think that's a really excellent book. I would say Beyond Containment by Claudia Jones. So Claudia Jones is really important to understand. I say British because she's born in Trinidad. She goes to America. She comes here. Really important intellectual. It starts the West Indian Gazette, the first Black British newspaper, and it's a collection of her writings. Actually a Marxist, and she's actually a Marxist as well, and one of the things that people miss is actually in American Marxism, it's Black people are really, really, really influential in the development of American Marxism and the CPUSA. Actually, so many of them. I'm trying to say like certainly to. I'm trying to think. I did this list of 10. I did a list for the Guardian of 10 top Black radical. If you really want some Black radicalism, and what's happening today, and neo-colonialism, which is really important, thinking about connecting this to the African continent. Kwame Nkrumah's book Africa Must Unite is really just really breaks down how little changed in the transition from former colonialism to neo-colonialism. I'd say that's an excellent one. And the British context of why people are mad now, Akala's book Natives. I mean, Akala just really breaks down. It was similar age as well, so it kind of really does. This ain't really changed. Like this really is still with us. And if people and Black Feminist Thought, which is a book I always recommend by Patricia Collins, which probably does the best to say, well, actually, Blackness is about understanding the universal through the particular, and there's a standpoint of Black feminism which you can really just illuminate how the world is. It's not just about Black women. It's not just about Black people. It really is about saying, well, actually, what does the world look like when you look? And when you look through a Black perspective, it is a very different perspective. So yeah, those are I could go on forever with books, but yeah.
No, it's fun. We've got a super chat here from BGG. Thank you, BGG, £4.99. How much do you think the establishment's weaponization of identity politics damages the BLM movement? We saw at the beginning of this, for instance, Keir Starmer and Nancy Pelosi taking the knee. Do you think that actively damages Black Lives Matter movement?
It shouldn't, right? I mean, and this is one of the key things of radicalism is independence. Like we do what we're going to do, and the mainstream is going to paint it in any way they're going to paint it. Whether it be terrorists, where it's going to be appropriated, where it's going to be whatever it's going to be. It shouldn't at all, right? I mean, definitely I roll my eyes and we just carry on doing whatever it is we're doing. And I think that's how we should always approach what the mainstream are doing.
Final question. This is from Thomas McKeown. It's a good question. How do we talk about the racist policies of politicians, black and brown politicians, like Priti Patel, who hide behind their own race to avoid answering for them? So I guess there's a mobilization there of liberal identity politics by reactionaries. How do you respond to that? Somebody like Priti Patel would say, well, how can I be racist? I'm brown. Let's say you're in a room with Priti Patel and it's caught on camera, or you're on, GMB. How do you respond to that?
How would I respond to that? I mean, I would probably evoke my inner Malcolm here. And Malcolm X is my absolute favorite. So from history, and he was very clear. Like, you gotta call it Uncle Tom or Uncle Tom. Like, let's just be honest. And this is I don't know what else can you say? There are, particularly on the right, there are a number of figures who are put there because they are minorities. Let's be honest. Priti Patel was sacked from the government. Shouldn't even be in there. Like, the fact she's in the government is crazy. The fact she's Home Secretary is deeply worrying. And okay, a white person can't say it, but I will say it. She's there because she's brown. That's why she's there. Figurehead, it looks good. And because of that, she's head of immigration policy. And the whole point of her being there is so that she can push through this terribly racist immigration policy, but has the cover of, oh, I experienced racism because I'm brown. Yeah. That's what we call Uncle Tom. There is a word for it.
I mean, I would never use it for obviously anybody who's darker than myself. I'm perfectly happy to take the mickey out of somebody's sort of Middle Eastern heritage and say the same thing. But the worst is Candace Owens, right? Candace Owens says stuff which is like proper white nationalism.
Yeah,
it's kind of crazy.
The blackface of white racism, right? There's money to be made. Look, if I wanted to retire today, I know what I should do to start dissing black people. I'd be rich. I could go off. But But this is not new. This has always been a tool that's been used. Whether it's in India, if you look at the people who, look at the people who actually ran the colonies, lots of them were Indian, right? Same in Africa, same in the Caribbean. This isn't a new thing at all. It's a legitimization of white supremacy by using black and brown faces to do it. And we should just call it out what it is, straight up.
On that note, we'll finish up. Kehinde, you've been fantastic. If people want to learn more about what he has to think, you can check out Back to Black. It's out with Zed Books. I think they're going to struggle to buy on Amazon at the moment, but you can always try or go to the Zed website. Yeah, are you going just to finish up? Are you teaching soon, or because you're at Birmingham City University? What's the vibe now?
So it's all a bit up in the air. So terms just finished. We are going back. There'll be some university, and we do have Black Studies course, Black Studies program, where we do a lot of this stuff on the course. But yeah, it's all up in the air as to whether we'll be on campus or online. Who knows? But the way the government's messed this up, I would expect we'll probably be online.
Yeah. Well, best of luck.
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll be in touch again soon.
Yes, thank you.
Pleasure. See you, mate.
Yes.
Bye.